This video is brought to you by Policy Genius. If you've got family members who depend on your income, you need life insurance, and that's where Policy Genius comes in. More on them in just a bit. It was the week before Christmas 1888 when Richard Wetherill and his brother-in-law made the discovery of a lifetime. Searching for missing cattle in the wilds of Colorado, the two stumbled across the rim of a deep canyon. It was a cold day with snow swirling under vast grey skies. Yet as the men stood on the edge of the cliff, they realized they could see something strange through the blizzard. An ancient city cut into the rock, a stone palace that dwarfed any building they'd ever seen. The name those awestruck men gave the find? Cliff Palace. Today it's recognized as one of the great structures in North American history. Built 800 years ago by the ancestral Puebloans, a culture previously known as the Anasazi, Cliff Palace was the culmination of half a millennia's worth of settlement at Mesa Verde. Growing organically over generations, at its height it's thought to have housed over 100 people. Yet this heyday didn't last. By 1300 AD, Cliff Palace and Mesa Verde had been abandoned and the ancestral Puebloans had vanished from Colorado. In their wake, they left only ruins, remnants of a place and an era we're still trying to understand today. Seen from the window of a car, the Four Corners region of the American West, where the states of Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico meet, appears spectacularly barren, a wilderness of scrub, desert, and unimaginably vast sky. But slow down to a walking pace, or better yet, go with someone who knows their stuff, and it'll soon become apparent that there's more to this area than meets the eye. In fields, at the edge of forests, and on public lands lie the ruins of once great structures, so many crammed in such a small place that it's now recognized as one of the highest concentrations of archaeological sites in the world. The work of the ancestral Puebloans, most of these structures are today hidden from view, an act of respect to their descendants who don't believe that they should be excavated. Yet there's one great building that remains visible, a masterpiece of ancient engineering that stood for centuries. Located in what's today Mesa Verde National Park, Cliff Palace is a testament to the architectural skill of the ancestral Puebloans, a structure as vast as it is beautiful. But who were its pre-Columbian builders, and how did they come to create their greatest monument? To answer that, we'll have to go back in time, all the way to the beginning of an era known as Basket Maker III. Beginning around 500 AD, Basket Maker III marks the point where the ancestral Puebloans started transitioning from a hunter-gatherer existence to one based on farming. Since history likes to be confusing, they're known in this era as basket makers, after the incredible weaving still evident in, well, you probably guessed it, their baskets. Pretty soon, though, those weaving skills were going to expand in spectacular new directions, one encompassing not just architecture, but also pottery and art. Nowhere was this more evident than at Mesa Verde. Blessed with fertile soil, natural drainage, underground springs, and regular-ish rainfall, Mesa Verde was basically an ancient farmer's late-night bedroom ceiling fantasy. As early as 590 AD, the basket makers had begun to settle her, building pit houses arranged into tiny hamlets. But it was in 750 AD that things really kicked into gear. The basket makers suddenly abandoned their pit homes and started building upwards. Houses with mud walls huddled together, their curving sides running indistinguishably from one home to the next. It's at this point that we can drop the whole basket maker thing and start calling them the Pueblo people, from the Spanish word for village. Not that village does justice to these structures. As the centuries passed, the Puebloans started building what they called grand houses, huge continuous structures housing scores of people. By 1000 AD, these grand houses were rising into the air atop the mesas, magnificent buildings containing 50 or more rooms. At the same time, the region saw a revolution in farming as new crops were planted and more space cleared for agriculture. This, in turn, helped fuel the population explosion. As the 12th century dawned, it was likely on a Mesa Verde community of several thousand, far more than the 800 or so at the dawn of the Puebloan era. But it would be the next era, beginning around 1200 AD, that saw the most fascinating change. Saw the ancestral Puebloans of the canyon abandon their ground-level grand houses and start living in the cliffs themselves. One of the things you just have to bear in mind when learning about the ancestral Puebloans is that they left behind no written records, no useful books explaining why they did things. Occasionally you can find clues in the oral tales still told by their descendants. More often than not, though, you're just struck trying to guess. And that includes guessing why the society in Mesa Verde started making cliff dwellings. The most obvious answer would be for defense. A house carved into a cliff and only accessible by a ladder is a hell of a lot harder to invade than a ground-based dwelling. But archaeologists are far from having reached a consensus on this. It could be that other factors were at play, from religious motives to simply needing better protection against the elements. All we know is that at some point between 1150 AD and 1200, the people of the Four Corners region were all like, living on the ground is for losers, I'm building myself a cliff house. The results speak for themselves. To call the cliff dwellings merely impressive would be to undersell just how cool these things really are. Built into natural sandstone cavities, each is shaped according to the space available, meaning structures run from a single room to almost 150. They were all built using simple but extremely effective methods and materials. In Mesa Verde, this took the form of sandstone blocks, each about the size of a loaf of bread. Painstakingly shaped using harder stones, they were then laid with the mortar made from a mix of ash, soil, and water. To this, the Puebloans also added a secret ingredient: chinking. Tiny pieces of stone tossed into the mortar, chinking effectively turns the Pueblo walls from something that's going to fall on your head one day to still going to be standing 800 years from now. When also reinforced with wooden beams, the result was a stable structure that could act as a combined home and place to store crops. Yet these were just the basic dwellings. What about the biggest one of all, the one for which this video is named? Well, it probably started in a similar way, as a smaller dwelling that soon grew into the cliff version of one of those grand houses. Beginning circa 1200, construction on the Cliff Palace lasted all the way through until 1275. Not that this was a continuous process or even a centralized one. Each family built its own space, leading to a crazy level of variation in quality, as if Frank Lloyd Wright had been forced to build a conjoining home with Homer Simpson. But it's also this approach that gives Cliff Palace its otherworldly charm, the sense of a place that's grown organically as it changed to fit each family's needs. And the thing each extended family needed most was, well, 1, a place to sleep, and 2, a kiva. Presuming you're not already an ancestral Puebloan enthusiast, you might now be wondering, well, what is a kiva? The short answer is that they were the focus of family life. A small circular pit, kivas appear all over the Cliff Palace, some 23 in all. Set out in open air, they were where people gathered for rituals and held ceremonies, with each extended family likely having their own. Around these vital spaces, rooms would be built for people to sleep, creating a combined living and communal space that seems to have formed the backbone of the settlement. According to the National Park Service, 75% of Cliff Palace is taken up with these combo spaces, with the rest mostly being storage rooms, special kivas for bigger ceremonies, and towers. So that's how Cliff Palace came into being, in a slow, piecemeal way over the course of some 75 years. But there's another side to this remarkable site that we need to explore, one that goes beyond just its physical construction. And that's, what was it actually like for those living there? Now, just before we continue with today's video, let me give a plug to today's fantastic sponsor, Policy Genius. Look, nobody likes to think about life insurance, but the reality is that it's an important layer of protection for many families, especially single-income households. Fortunately, there's Policy Genius and their award-winning policy options, which were ranked #1 by Forbes. Whether you've been putting off your purchase or you just never really thought about it, Policy Genius is the team you want to check in with. This is a third-party marketplace that works for you, not for the insurance companies, so you can trust that their licensed experts are going to give you solid, unbiased advice. Life insurance premiums might seem like a financial drain, but you could save $1,300 or more per year using Policy Genius to compare life insurance policies. If you're interested, head to policygenius.com to get started. And in just a few minutes, you can work out how much coverage you need and compare personalized quotes to find your best price. When you're ready to apply, the Policy Genius team will handle the paperwork and the scheduling, all for free. You could save 50% or more on life insurance by comparing quotes with Policy Genius, and getting covered now locks in your rate. Over the course of a 10 or 20-year policy, those savings add up. And best of all, eligible applicants can get covered in as little as a week. Head to policygenius.com to get started, and you'll be glad you did, because when it comes to life insurance, it's nice to get it right. And now back to today's video. Seen up close today, Cliff Palace still seems impossibly vast, a stone monster made of ancient bricks. And that's from our perspective. Us, the dudes who live in a world where the Burj Khalifa is an actual thing. From the perspective of those who lived there, Cliff Palace would have been on a scale that was almost unimaginable. Give you some idea of scale, we need to look at the other cliff dwellings in Mesa Verde. Out of a total of 600, nearly 3/4 top out at 5 rooms, with many not even managing that. By contrast, Cliff Palace contains 150 rooms plus those 23 kivas we talked about earlier. Over 100 people, and possibly as many as 150, called it home. Now, this isn't the largest structure ancestral Puebloans ever built. Not even close. The now ruined Yellow Jacket Pueblo in Cortez once held almost 700 people. The difference is that Yellow Jacket was built on the ground. As far as cliff dwellings go, almost nothing beats Cliff Palace. Only Longhouse, also within Mesa Verde, comes remotely close. So yeah, Cliff Palace was big for its era, and that most likely means that it was also powerful. With another 60-odd cliff dwellings clustered nearby, it saw that the palace was a kind of hub for the wider community, one encompassing about 625 souls. The 100 or so who lived within its walls would have shared rooms of about 6 by 8 feet. Rooms modern analysis showed us were once painted bright colours, pastel pinks and yellows and reds. On some walls, the families who lived there also painted striking geometric murals, some of which may just be patterns, others of which may be abstract representations of real things. They were also something of an artistic trademark. If you've heard of the people of Mesa Verde before, you've probably heard of their pottery for the simple reason that it was, to use a highly technical term, balls out awesome. Often taking the form of white vessels decorated with black patterns, these jugs and pots were created by highly skilled craftspeople who then marked them with geometric designs remarkably similar to the murals. There's evidence too that these designs meant something to their creators. Pottery at Mesa Verde is thought to have largely stayed within families, passed down from generation to generation. That makes each bowl or ladle we uncover not just a piece of history in general, but a piece of someone's personal history, a fragment of a chapter of a life story that took place here long ago. Of course, the majority of these stories have now been lost to time, whole metaphorical libraries of books about family feuds, who loved who, and what their authors dreamed of, just reduced to dust. Still, we've uncovered enough evidence through excavations to say one thing for certain. Those living in Cliff Palace endured lives that we would consider impossibly hard. Winters in this part of Colorado can be miserably cold, with temperatures hovering around 14 degrees Fahrenheit, or what people who use sane measurements call -10 Celsius. We can still see traces of the fires that must have burned throughout the winter, blackening the walls as families huddled around them for warmth. And that's when they weren't outsourcing food. Although the ancestral Puebloans were farmers growing enough corn, beans, and squash to create surpluses, they still needed to constantly hunt and forage to supplement their diets. That meant a whole lot of work all year round, and even young folk had no guarantee they'd survive till the following summer. Average life expectancy was around 33 years, although this was mostly thanks to insane levels of infant mortality dragging that average down. The good news is that if you made it into adulthood, you might well live into your 50s or 60s. The bad news is that was a hell of an if. Half of children born in Mesa Verde died before the age of 5. Still, those who survived were likely close. Generations of the same family would have lived together, with extended members clustered in nearby rooms. Overall, then, life in Cliff Palace was hard by our modern standards, but probably fine enough for those who were born there. They had close family, they had food and shelter. They could take great joy from their art or from the beautiful things brought into their community along trade networks that stretched as far as the Pacific coast. Yet, stable as it was, this way of life would soon be over all too soon. Within 3/4 of a century of work beginning on Cliff Palace, it would be abandoned, as would all the other dwellings of Mesa Verde. And it's here that we get to one of the greatest mysteries in American archaeology, a mystery that can be summed up in a single word. Why? When the first white people discovered the ruins of Cliff Palace, they assumed the great mystery hanging over it was what happened to the builders. Fascinated by this vanished culture, they gave them the name Anasazi, from the Navajo word Anasazi, meaning old ones or enemy ancestors. Today, though, we know the framing of the question was all wrong. Nothing mysterious happened to the builders. Their descendants are still alive and living in pueblos, primarily in New Mexico. No, the mystery wasn't what happened to the ancestral Puebloans or where they went to, but figuring out exactly why they left. Why turn their backs not just on Cliff Palace, not just on Mesa Verde, but on the whole region, once thought to have been home to as many as 25,000 people? Sadly, the best we can offer, by way of a definitive answer, is just a confused shrug. But archaeologists do have theories, and you'll be glad to hear none of them involve aliens. The most popular theory is that the Great Drought battered the region, forcing a wave of migration. Lasting from 1276 to 1299, the Great Drought was a quarter century of Armageddon across the western US. Today known, thanks to the record it left in tree rings, the drought would have ruined crops, destroyed water sources, and left an already parched land shriveled and dead. Since its start point coincides with more or less the exact time that construction stopped at Cliff Palace, it seems like an obvious cause of the area's abandonment. Certainly, it might explain some of the violence associated with the migration, like the apparent massacre of 41 people at Castle Rock Pueblo, or the gruesome traces of cannibalism found on some of the bones from this era. Yet, recent research has cast doubt on this theory. Running from 2001 to 2014, the Village Ecodynamics Project collected all sorts of data on ancestral Puebloans and their environment, allowing scientists in wildly different disciplines to run complex computer simulations. When a bunch of hydrologists crunched the numbers, they found that springs were so common across the region that not even the greatest drought could have completely cut Cliff Palace off from water. The soil, too, would have been capable of retaining enough moisture to allow subsistence farming even during extreme weather. In other words, while living through the Great Drought would have sucked, it shouldn't have sucked hard enough to drive people off land that they'd inhabited for centuries. That's why some researchers think other factors were involved. Popular theories include issues with deforestation or soil erosion, or attacks from nomadic tribes. There's even a theory that inequality put the final nail in Mesa Verde's coffin. Archaeologist Scott Orman of the University of Colorado Boulder notes that each family in Mesa Verde would have had their own parcels of land to farm, with plots staying in one clan even as the population exploded. That might have been fine in normal weather, but when massive drought hit, it's possible that those stuck with the crappier plots found themselves unable to provide for their kin. In other words, the perfect conditions to foment revolution or civil war. Still, intriguing as these theories are, the simple fact is that we can't say for certain what happened. The only inarguable facts are that Cliff Palace was abandoned sometime in the 1280s, with the wider region following suit shortly after. In some places, the kivas left behind seemed to have been burned, possibly as some kind of ritual. In others, the inhabitants seem to have simply got up and walked away one forgotten morning, leaving behind textiles and pottery. As to where these vanished people went, well, the answer lies in front of our eyes. Today, it's widely recognized that the Pueblo tribes of New Mexico are the descendants of the ancestral Puebloans. While linking specific tribes to Cliff Palace and Mesa Verde is contentious, there are clues buried in the languages used, in the stories told, that could point towards an answer. Scott Orman, for one, has suggested that the Tiwa people could be their descendants. Others point to the modern-day speakers of the Carey's language. Either way, the point stands. The ancestral Puebloans didn't all fly off to Nirabu in ancient spaceships. They migrated south and west, away from whatever problems bedeviled their home. By the time white people stumbled across that home 600 years later, Cliff Palace would be nothing but a remarkable ruin. The centuries following Mesa Verde's abandonment were unkind to both Cliff Palace and the descendants of those who built it. In the case of the former, the passage of time took this great architectural work and slowly destroyed it. Hundreds of years of wind and rain, of freezing and thawing, of intrusion by wild animals did their work, leading walls to crack, roofs to collapse, and towers to fall. The southern half of the structure, built on loose dirt, began to slowly sink, pulling rooms apart. By the 19th century, the ruins that were still standing were surrounded by rubble. If anything, the Pueblo peoples fared even worse. The 16th century brought with it a wave of Spanish conquistadors who acted like they'd seen what awful things other colonial powers were up to, and you thought, you know what? We could be even worse than that. In what is now New Mexico, Pueblo tribes had their kivas burned, their villages ransacked, their religions and languages outlawed. Those who refused Catholicism were whipped, hanged, or sold into slavery. Those who still resisted might have hands or feet cut off to set an example. At their worst, the Spanish slaughtered or enslaved entire pueblos. Things got so bad that the normally peaceful tribes rebelled in 1680, chasing the Spanish out for 12 whole years. Sadly, this would turn out to be just a hiatus, a little breather before the Europeans came charging back in, bearing the grim gifts of racism and smallpox. Come 1888, both the builders and the building itself had suffered terribly. But it would only be the plight of one of them that caught the wider world's eye. That December the 18th, Richard Wetherill and Charlie Mason were tracking lost cattle through a snowstorm when they found themselves at the edge of a canyon. Through the snow, the men made out what appeared to be the ruins of a once great city. Although native peoples in the region had long known of the ruins, Wetherill and Mason were likely the first white people to lay eyes on them. Awestruck, they named the ruin Cliff Palace, the name we still use today. That same winter, Wetherill conducted the site's first amateur archaeological dig. And so began a strange, complicated process that both nearly ruined and ultimately saved Cliff Palace. The thing was, Wetherill lived at a time when people digging up indigenous ruins weren't like, gee, I gotta be really respectful about this, but more like, awesome, more shit to steal. After selling the artifacts he'd recovered to the Colorado Historical Society, Wetherill invited the Finnish-Swedish explorer Gustav Nordenskjöld to do his own dig in the summer of 1891. While Nordenskjöld would write an influential book putting Mesa Verde on the map, it also cut off an insane number of artifacts that Finland would refuse to return until 2019. Worse, Nordenskjöld's book would be such a hit that the years 1891 to 1906 saw an insane number of people come to Cliff Palace and try to make their own discoveries. Unlike Wetherill and Nordenskjöld, who were at least interested in the history side of things, these latter explorers broke things, stole stuff, and even set off goddamn dynamite in the ruins. Luckily, not every old-timey person was a total idiot, though. As the looting at Mesa Verde and nearby Chaco culture sites got worse, a backlash began, one that demanded the government protect the region from vandals. Finally, in 1906, Teddy Roosevelt signed the Antiquities Act, making it illegal to loot or damage sites on public land. That same year, Mesa Verde was declared a national park. 2 years later, the Bureau of American Ethnology was sent in to stabilize Cliff Palace. While the team did indulge in some fanciful repairs, they at least helped stop the site's slow erosion. Since then, multiple teams have gone back across the decades to help stabilize the ancient walls. Importantly, everyone since the 1930s has kept minute records of improvements so we can tell what's original and what has been reconstructed. Today, Cliff Palace, like the whole of Mesa Verde, is not just a national park, but it's a recognized tourist destination. So many people want to visit, spurred on by its designation as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, that the Park Service actively limits visitor numbers each year to help preserve what's left. And what remains is certainly worth preserving. Here in a canyon in the southwest corner of Colorado sits the last fascinating remains of one of North America's great cultures. Although it may be a ruin now, Cliff Palace is also a link, not just between us and modern people and a bygone era, but between the ancestral Puebloans and their descendants in New Mexico today. So it seems fitting to give the last word in this video to one of those descendants, T.J. Atzai of the Laguna Pueblo, who supplied the National Park Service with this haunting quote about the great cliff dwellings her ancestors once called home. Even though we physically moved away, the spirits of my ancestors are still here. If you stop for a minute and listen, you can hear the children laughing and the women talking. You can hear the dogs barking and the turkeys gobbling. You can hear and feel the beat of the drums and the singing. You can smell the cooking fires. You can feel their presence, their warmth, their sense of community. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe, and thank you for watching.